Good afternoon, everyone. If I didn't know better, I would assume that we've all stayed here overnight just to get a seat this morning. This is the second part. This is the second part of what is a six-part fugue. The main line is provided by the 3 Tuesday evening lectures delivered by Andrea Berlin, the Levy Foundation Professor of Jewish Material Culture. And the Wednesday afternoons are the responses, the polyphony, 3 different lines taking over parts of the argument, perhaps disagreeing, amplifying, extending, and maybe even improvising a little. So we start with this afternoon, continuation itself, and perhaps amplification of something that we heard last night. Alex Jassen, Associate Professor of Hebrew and Judaic Studies and Director of Graduate Studies in the Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at New York University. His BA in Jewish Studies and Near Eastern Languages and Literatures from the University of Washington, PhD from NYU itself. He had previously taught at the University of Minnesota, a subterraneous connection to Andrea Berlin also, unplanned. He was recipient there of the university's prestigious McKnight Land Grant Fellowship. He's the author of several books focusing on the literary world of the later Second Temple period, the author of Mediating the Divine, Prophecy, and Revelation in the Dead Sea Scrolls and Second Temple Judaism, which in 2009 won the John Templeton Award for Theological Promise, whether it's the promise written about or the promise of the professor, unclear from the award. Also author of Scripture and Law in the Dead Sea Scrolls, published in 2014, and a co-editor of Scripture, Violence, and Textual Practice in Early Judaism and Christianity. He is as well the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Ancient Judaism. And he was most recently on television for CNN's series Finding Jesus, Fact, Faith, and Forgery. How much of that will come into today's discussion on the formation of cultural practice. I'm very sorry. So how much of that will feature into today's discussion of the emergence of cultural practice in the 2nd century? We will find out, but it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to welcome Alex Jassen.
Can everybody hear me okay?
No, it's not working. It's not
on. It sounds like it's on. Okay, I will try to project my voice as loudly as possible. Is that better? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Peter, for that nice introduction. It's nice to be back here. I feel like I never left since it was only a few hours ago that we were listening to Andrea's stimulating talk, and I had the opportunity to spend a few moments reflecting on that. And it's really a great pleasure to be here to share some of my own insights into my own scholarship. And as you heard from the very nice rendition of my greatest hits, you should know, I will say this in passing, that I was on TV for about 2 minutes on CNN, but every single person I'm related to and all of their friends made sure to note that, call me and say, hey, I saw you on TV, so apparently that's the great payoff. But you heard from much of how my research was described in that brief recounting that I deal primarily with literary texts. And as I was looking at my screen, I also noticed that my chosen PowerPoint template is also a book. This is meant to be a book, and I use this because as you see flip through the pages, the non-title screen also kind of looks like leaves of a codex or a manuscript. So it's hard to kind of step away from the literary. But in thinking about this project for today and the kind of broader project in which it fits into, I really wanted to reflect seriously on how literary texts and material culture can go together. So my talk today is an inquiry into the emergence of a distinct set of practices among Jews in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, and I'll probably be focusing more on the tail end of that time period. These practices represent in broad contours the beginnings of what would become the core of Jewish religious practices and grow at an exponential rate in the following centuries. Prior to the 2nd century BCE, aspects of Jewish ritual practice either existed in purely literary forms or were confined to the elite circles of priests. While the so-called common Jew, we'll come back to that term in a moment, seems to have participated in aspects of broad Jewish ritual practice, there is little evidence for more widespread observance of Jewish law prior to the 2nd or the 1st century BCE. Today, I want to explore the ways in which a multi-pronged approach, utilizing textual evidence and dialogue with material culture, allows us to chart the historical emergence of this shift in practice, what I am calling a social history of Jewish law. My presentation is divided into 3 parts. First, a general introduction to the question of Jewish law and practice in ancient Judaism. 2, discussion of the methodological challenges that inhere in such a project. And 3, a specific example that I hope will serve as a case study for further inquiry. When I began an email exchange with Andrea last spring about this lecture series and began to consider my own contribution, I went back and read some of Andrea's scholarship on our intersecting areas of interest, that is, Jews and Judaism of the late Second Temple period. This is the time period from about the 2nd century BCE through the 1st century CE. As I noted last night, histories of this time period tend to be written with the textual evidence guiding the historian's narrative. In thinking about this lecture series, I spent a considerable amount of time working through Andrea's work on what she has called household Judaism. This refers to the lived experience of Judaism that she locates in the 1st centuries BCE and CE, that stands outside of the main framework of Judaism as experienced by the elites, especially priests in the Jerusalem temple and their affiliates who adhere to a certain practice of Judaism. For Andrea, household Judaism can be seen in the material culture of this time period and the growth of material possessions that encode and reflect Jewish identity. Is that a fair summary? Okay. This got me thinking quite a bit on the topic that is constantly on my mind, both because of my own research in Judaism of the Second Temple period and because this topic often comes up in my teaching. Put simply, what did the normal Jew in the Second Temple period do as it related to observance and practice of Jewish law? This question is both guided by and problematized by the vantage point of the long scope of later Jewish history. Jewish ritual practice, what later Judaism would term halacha, is such an identifiable marker of Judaism and so often tied to its perceived biblical connections that it may seem odd to ask when this form of practice actually emerges. Let me jump right into offering some concrete material for us to consider that will help us see more clearly the questions I am addressing. I have chosen 2 sets of texts as focal points for the beginning of this inquiry. These 2 texts share some common elements. Both are Jewish recollections of the decrees of a foreign power as it relates to the practice of Judaism. In this sense, we are seeing the vantage point of a so-called insider who is reporting on the vantage point of an outsider. And you can either follow along on the screen or there should be a handout that went around as well. Okay. The first comes from the book of 2 Maccabees, which I spoke for a few minutes about last night. The book of 2 Maccabees recounts part of the story of the Hasmonean victory in the 2nd century BCE over the Seleucid Empire, which had enacted a series of decrees that proscribed the practice of Judaism. The book itself was likely written towards the end of the 2nd century BCE. The author identifies the book as an epitome of a larger 5-volume work by a man named Jassen of Cyrene, about whom we know nothing else. This work is written in Greek. The language and other aspects of the book suggest that it was produced somewhere in the Jewish diaspora, probably Alexandria. In chapter 6, which I've given you the first 6 verses plus an extra one here, our author recounts the moment when the Seleucid king Antiochus outlaws Judaism. And I'll read the entire passage, but I want to call your attention to the bold-faced part. Not long after this, the king sent an Athenian senator to compel the Jews to forsake the laws of their fathers and cease to live by the laws of God, and also to pollute the temple in Jerusalem and call it the temple of Olympian Zeus, and to call the one in Gerizim the temple of Zeus, the friend of strangers. Notice, of course, as we learned about last night, there was also a temple in Mount Gerizim that had close connections with the cult in Jerusalem, as did the people who dwelt in that place. Harsh and utterly grievous was the onslaught of evil, for the temple was filled with debauchery and reveling by the Gentiles who dallied with harlots and had intercourse with women within the sacred precincts, and besides brought in things for sacrifices that were unfit. The altar was covered with abominable offerings which were forbidden by the laws. And then again here, a man could neither keep the Sabbath nor observe the feasts of his fathers, nor as much confess himself to be a Jew. Later, after our author has recounted how the Jews were forced to participate in sacrifices to the Greek gods, we are told about particular groups of Jews who were pursued by the Greeks and killed for practicing Judaism in hiding. One such incident describes women who secretly circumcised their sons. The other chronicles the fate of a group who had assembled in the caves nearby to observe the Sabbath secretly. This is verse 11 here. We are told that they were betrayed by Philip, this is the local put in charge by the Greeks, and were all burned together because their piety kept them from defending themselves in view of their regard for that most holy day. Several questions arise from this passage. Verse 6, in bold here, ends with the interesting formulation, to confess himself to be a Jew. First, I should note that scholars debate what the Greek word Judaios actually means here. Is it a resident of the Greek province of Judea, and thus perhaps best translated as Judean? Or is it more like what we think of as somebody who adheres to a certain set of cultural and religious practices, akin to what we might now call religious affiliation? The juxtaposition of this statement with the emphasis on practice suggests something more like the latter. But what exactly did it mean to confess to be a Jew? This likely has in mind certain aspects of belief, but in this particular passage, the specific examples all revolve around practice. The passage opens with a reference to the ancestral laws and provides two specific examples in verse 6, the Sabbath and the festivals. The latter is also identified with an ancient tradition. As the section continues, a third example is provided, circumcision. The highlighting of these three aspects speaks to their prominence in Jewish practice and that they were recognizable to outsiders as distinctive Jewish practices. But surely there was more at play for a Jew in the 2nd century. Put simply, what does it mean for the average Jew in the 2nd century BCE to confess to be a Jew, such that Antiochus outlawed such practices? The second text comes from the pen of Josephus, the 1st century CE historian of Jews and Judaism. Here, in his Antiquities of the Jews, he is recounting, in fact claiming to be citing verbatim, an edict from Augustus pertaining to the Jews of Ankara and Galatia, likely dating to the end of the 1st century BCE. According to Josephus, this edict was inscribed upon the altar of Augustus in Ankara. The key part is outlined in boldface. That the Jews, and this is again what Augustus provided as a protection for the Jews, that the Jews have liberty to make use of their own customs according to the law of their forefathers, as they made use of them under Hyrcanus, the high priest of the Almighty God, and that their sacred money be not touched, but be sent to Jerusalem, that it be committed to the care of the receivers at Jerusalem, and that they may be obliged to go before any judge, not be obliged to go before any judge on the Sabbath day, nor on the day of preparation to it after the 9th hour. I'm glad everybody's paying close attention. Thank you. That's good to know. As in the passage from 2 Maccabees, this passage raises a number of interesting questions and challenges. The edict likewise refers to the fact that Jews had customs and practices that are imagined as ancestral. Some are in the realm of what we might call cultural practice, that is, donating money to the temple. Yet here as well, it is clear that these customs extended to the realm of religious practice, deemed to stem from ancient tradition, as evinced by the mention of the Sabbath. It is particularly interesting that this passage offers a specific example of what is regarded as aspects of its observance. Remember, this is intended to be from an outsider's vantage point, taking part in court proceedings. Moreover, this is regarded as an issue not only on the Sabbath, but after a certain time in the day prior to the onset of the Sabbath. That is, on the eve of the Sabbath, things would stop before the Sabbath actually began. I chose these 2 passages because they speak to many of the key questions I wish to address, while they simultaneously underscore many of the challenges presented by such an inquiry. Both texts indicate that Jews in the Second Temple period are characterized by adherence to a set of practices that are imagined as stemming from an ancestral tradition. These texts also speak to the tangled web of Jewish communities. In 2 Maccabees, a diaspora writer recounts the conditions of Jews living in the land of Israel. In Josephus, a Jerusalemite living in Rome recounts the experiences of Jews in the Roman diaspora. Moreover, both passages provide concrete examples. These 2 passages simultaneously underscore the importance of context. They are presented as records of foreign understanding of Jewish identity and practice, though filtered through the lens of Jewish writers who put them in the broader context of Jewish historical experience. Both of these passages lump all Jews together and imagine a singular practice. This introduces another challenge to my query from a moment ago. While Antiochus or Augustus lumps all Jews together, we know that the social landscape of Judaism was far more diverse, especially as it pertains to practices. Are we talking about the priests in the Jerusalem temple and the elites in their surrounding orbit? What about the Jews who identify with one of the famous sects of ancient Judaism, the famous Pharisees, Sadducees, or Essenes, or the group associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, the only group in this time period for which we have some of their own writings and presumably also their archaeological context? But what about the Jews who stand outside of these settings? What was likely the majority of the Jews? Put in the context of the 2 passages we just explored, what exactly would Jews have been doing in practice that would have been outlawed by Antiochus and protected by Augustus? Let me now turn to challenges posed by the second half of my primary inquiry, the practice of Jewish law and ritual. This description, Jewish law and ritual, is a drawn-out description of what later Rabbinic Judaism, which emerges in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, describes in a succinct manner as halakha, the totality of Jewish civil, criminal, and religious law. The core documents of Rabbinic Judaism, beginning in the early 3rd century CE onward, outline an extremely detailed set of practices that they regarded as governing Jewish practice for all those types of Jews I mentioned a moment ago, from the temple priest to the Jew on the street. One of the major questions that has animated scholars from the very beginning of the modern academic study of Judaism in the 19th century has been the history of halakha, the history of Jewish law. Scholars saw later Rabbinic Judaism with its fully developed halachic system governing all aspects of life and crystallized down to its most minute details, and wondered how this emerged in such a form in the 3rd century CE. This enterprise, I should note, was done almost entirely through the analysis of textual material. The significance of law among the early followers of Jesus represents the other half of this scholarly inquiry. On the one hand, the Gospels present many stories of Jesus and his followers performing and debating the particulars of Jewish law. But much of the scholarly discussion is framed in the context of broader ideas about the law in order to understand Paul's theology of law. The 20th century saw the emergence of so much new evidence and many new methodological approaches. We have the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, countless number of excavations throughout the land of Israel and the Jewish diaspora. All said, we have at our disposal a remarkable abundance of data to work with. Yet still, we must recognize that we really only have a sliver of the evidence from this time period. Let me frame this in the context of an analogy. When we go to a theatrical performance, we see the stage only after the curtain has gone up. The set arrangements, the performer blocking on stage, the script that eventually plays out, all these final pieces are the result of a long process of development. Ideas percolate and are tried out and then are abandoned, replaced by new ideas. We only see the end result once the curtain rises. We know that things were happening behind the curtain, and we can likely theorize as to what they are, but we still don't have direct access. Evidence such as the direct Dead Sea Scrolls and other material culture from the Second Temple period allows us to peek behind that curtain. But even this expanded evidence is only a sliver of the data. It's as if, in reality, somebody has kind of run backstage with a camera and took a bunch of random snapshots and said, here, go reconstruct this history of what happened behind the curtain, right? In the case of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they took the snapshots and then tore them up in tiny pieces. Same thing with the material culture, right? Everything's broken. So it's not really, a full behind-the-scenes look. New methodological advances also force us to rethink how earlier generations approached the long history of Jewish law. Scholars have long seen Rabbinic Judaism with its fully developed system of halakha in their writings beginning in the 3rd century BCE as not just a whole set of texts and ideas, but reflective of widespread Jewish practice. Put simply, scholars assumed that the rabbinic story of origins and authority was related to historical reality. The rabbis presented themselves as discerning halacha as normative practice for wide groups of Jews that were assumed to be in their orbit of authority. Thus, the question of the history of halacha was seen to reach its culmination not just in the development of highly developed literary form, but also this body of literature as prescriptive for Jewish practice. This creates an interesting bookend in the history of Jewish law. Scholars, beginning in the 19th century, were trying to chart the development of Jewish law from the Bible to the rabbis. What we know so clearly now is that there's a clear disconnect in both these corpora between the text and the practices. Scholars of what is called biblical law often describe the legal material in the Hebrew Bible, especially the Pentateuch, as literary rather than prescriptive. For example, while the Hebrew Bible outlines many specific aspects of practice that are expected of every Israelite, there is little evidence this was done in practice. Even when institutions did exist in some form, like the Sabbath, its observance hardly matches the literary form in which many of these institutions appear in biblical texts. So too the rabbis spend a considerable amount of mental and scribal energy outlining a system of Jewish law that is highly literary in nature. The example of the Sabbath is another good case in point. And I keep coming back to the Sabbath because you recall those were mentioned in both of the passages. The earliest rabbinic document, the 3rd century Mishnah, provides a long and detailed outline of Sabbath observance. The evidence, however, is really distorting for scholars interested in the history of Jewish law. The extensive and highly developed Sabbath laws almost certainly do not match how most Jews in the 3rd century and onward, until at a certain point, were actually observing the Sabbath. To return to my analogy of the theater performance, early rabbinic legal texts are like a monumental script with no stage and very few actors to perform it. Perhaps even more so, it is not simply the script, but a dramatic rewriting of every aspect of the theater and its operating principles. In some cases, the rabbis are writing a script for a space that no longer exists, when they spend tons and tons of energy and space talking about the temple and aspects of the temple life. The temple, of course, had been destroyed over a century before the rabbis began their writing projects. In the realm of religious law, there is little evidence to support widespread acceptance of the early rabbis as authorities on matters such as the Sabbath and festivals. I have spent a considerable amount of time outlining the wide range of this inquiry and the scale of the methodological challenges. All of this gets me back to why I am here at an institution that conceives of its mission to study the human past through its material traces, and participating in a lecture series that seeks to rectify the imbalance that places the greatest emphasis on texts when writing the history of ancient Judaism. In thinking more about this, serious combination of text and material culture is in my mind the only way to provide a fuller portrait of the social history of Jewish law and practice. In my remaining time, I would like to walk through a specific example where we can see that how the combination of text and archaeology works, I think, quite well in illuminating a particular aspect in the history of practice: the observance of purity regulations by Jews outside of the temple precincts. Here, I rely upon the incredible work of many scholars, especially Andrea, who have been able to mine the textual and archaeological data and combine them to craft a fairly wide-ranging understanding of Jewish practice. There has been so much work on this subject, especially as it relates to the material and remains of ritual baths, mikvaot, and stone vessels, more on the significance of these stone vessels in a moment, that we have to avoid the so-called kitchen sink approach to presenting the evidence, that is, just present all the data. This example, I think, serves as a useful case study for how we can curate the textual and material evidence in order to highlight its role in telling the larger story of the history of Jewish law. Let me begin with the two poles of law that historians have long known about: the biblical text and rabbinic literature. The purity laws in the Hebrew Bible are, put simply, confined to the realm of the priests. The reasons are presented as relatively straightforward. Religious practitioners with access to the sacred realm must maintain a state of ritual purity. The book of Leviticus outlines several sources of contagion, for example, corpses, blood, creeping, crawling creatures, seminal emission, and onward, right? These are because of sources of taboo that it's not exactly important why they are the sources of contagion, but Leviticus clearly has certain sources of contagion that render somebody impure, and impure people cannot access the sacred realm in the temple. Leviticus 7, for example, mandates that priests cannot eat the sacred food unless they are in a state of purity. Other purity laws have the priests uniquely in focus. Right? Put simply, without the sacred realm, Levitical priestly laws serve no purpose. By the time we get to the rabbinic text, beginning with the early 3rd century CE Mishnah and onward, the rabbis have a well-developed understanding of purity as it relates to every single Jew, both inside and outside of the temple. Moreover, the rabbis often recall that in the Second Temple period, a movement known as the Chavurah, literally the fellowship, ate food in a state of ritual purity. The same anecdote about the Pharisees is presented in the New Testament Gospels. The fact that the rabbis presume the extension of purity practices beyond the temple precincts and the realm of the priests is quite obvious. What is not at all obvious is, 1, the degree to which the Jews in the 2nd century CE onward, that is, the Jews in the time period of the rabbis, followed this practice. 2, how old the notion of non-priestly purity regulations, in fact, are. And 3, whether the memories of the Pharisees and these other groups in the Second Temple period have any historical validity. The integration of the Second Temple period evidence, both text and material culture, at the very least allows us to gain some further inquiry into the second question of how old is this practice of applying non-priestly purity regulations to all aspects of Jewish life. As most scholars note, the Second Temple period evidence presents a broad portrait of adherence to these non-priestly purity realms. I turn first to the archaeological evidence, specifically the example of stone vessels. Stone vessels, specifically soft chalk or limestone, began to emerge in the historical record in great numbers in the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE. This is important because many ancient Jewish sources indicate that stone was not susceptible to impurity contamination. Take, for example, the later straightforward rabbinic statement, stone vessels, dung vessels, and unfired earthenware vessels do not contract impurity according to the words of the Torah or according to the words of the scribes. In other words, if an individual is being careful about maintaining a state of ritual purity, that person would not need to worry about an impure person touching that stone vessel. Moreover, the vessel could be used for ritual practices, specifically those pertaining to liquid, because liquid was seen as a more highly susceptible to the transmission of impurity. Following carefully the purity strictures of Leviticus, we could imagine the priests in the Second Temple period would be especially interested in utilizing stone vessels. Our evidence, however, indicates a much more widespread growth in the employment of stone vessels. We see a notable change in the evidence at the tail end of the Second Temple period. The evidence suggests, and here I'm drawing upon Andrea's work, that there are 16 workshops devoted to the production of stone vessels. Right? This doesn't sound like a lot, but in relative terms, this is a lot. Okay? 5 of which are located very close to Jerusalem. The rest are scattered all over the land of Israel. All told, we have workshops in Judea, Transjordan, Galilee, and the Golan. There is, however, a notable absence of these workshops in places like Samaria, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Here we have images of one such workshop that was found in the environs of Jerusalem on the eastern slope of Mount Scopus. It was both the quarry and manufacturing workshop. And if you ever want to know how a stone vessel is made, because I did not understand this when I set out to this, and I said, how do they make a stone vessel? It's a remarkable process. They chose stone that was very malleable, this kind of soft limestone, and they quarried it out of the thing, and they had all these tools. It's a remarkable feat of engineering to think about 2,000 years ago. You can see the exterior of the cave. They were usually in these caves, and then over on the right, you see the production hall. And this is very close to the area now known as Mount Scopus. When we move from the manufacturing workshops to the stone vessels themselves, a related pattern emerges. We can pinpoint the moment in time when stone vessels gain widespread uses throughout the land of Israel. As we would expect, the robust industry that emerges at the end of the Second Temple period leaves a profound mark on the material remains of human life. These vessels are found in great abundance in Jerusalem and surrounding areas. For example, a massive amount of chalkstone vessels were found during the excavation of the city of David, that is ancient Jerusalem, undertaken between 1978 and 1985. Another well-excavated site is near the village of Hisma, 5 kilometers northeast of Jerusalem. And here you see some of the cups from the Hisma site. On the upper right are some of the cups from the Mount Scopus site. All said, excavations have yielded over 60 prominent sites with an abundance of stone vessels that you can see on the map here. And this map is actually from a few years ago, and it should be updated, as you're going to see in a moment. It is quite obvious that the majority of these sites, as with the production workshops, are located around Jerusalem. But there are very clearly clusters of sites elsewhere in places with local Jewish populations, the Galilee and the Golan. In fact, just this last August, there was an announcement about a site in Reina, in the lower Galilee, where many more stone vessels were found. Here you see some images that was from the press release. In addition to these sites, there are places where stone vessels do not predominate. I alluded to this a moment ago in context of the fact that we don't have workshops in certain places. The profiles of these sites are of two types. First, places like Samaria or Idumea, both places that we heard about last night, regions where Jews do not live in great numbers. And second, Jewish sites associated with the wealthy. Okay? Two particular examples that did not yield stone vessels are Herodium and Sebastia, both home to upper-class wealthy Jews. This evidence, however, is not absolute. That is the latter case. A few upper-class sites, especially mansions in the Jewish quarter of ancient Jerusalem, did have stone vessels. Not all upper-class Jews were alike. Here's where we need to think about how to put our textual and material culture evidence in dialogue with one another. If we only had these vessels, what would we do with them? How would we interpret them? We might say, well, stone vessels are inexpensive to produce, and maybe there was an economic downturn, right? There's lots of different ways we can think about the emergence of this specific aspect of human life. The texts, though, allow us to see some of this in clearer focus. The growth of stone vessels must be explained in dialogue with Jewish notions of ritual impurity and concerns about contamination. Otherwise, I'm not really sure what we would do with this data, right? Without the textual data, we would have no tangible way of knowing whether abstract ideas about non-priestly purity were actually practiced by ancient Jews, or how wide this practice would have been, right? If we had no, we can take the other side of the thing. If we had no stone vessels, and all we had were references in text to stone vessels not being sources of contagion, not being conduits for impurity, right? We would say the elites are having their academic discussions, big deal, right? As I have noted, scholars attribute the rise of these vessels to the widespread acceptance by non-priests of the regulations associated with living a life of purity. There are simply too many stone vessels, and they are far too dispersed for them simply to be associated with the priests. Thus far, I have discussed the vessels as one class, but as Andrea's analysis of the stone vessels demonstrates, they are not all the same. As we probe further into the subtleties of the material culture, here I admit with an archaeologist as my guide, we may be able to draw a more nuanced portrait of the textual data. Do these pictures look familiar?
Yes.
Andrea notes that the vessels can be classified into four functional groups. First, tall, deep, wide-mouthed jars. Those are on the left there. Large-handled mugs. These are oftentimes referred to in the literature as measuring cups because they were mistakenly identified as measuring cups initially. They're probably mugs. 3, now we go to the right side, vessels suitable for group service of food and drink, such as large bowls and trays. And 4, also on the right, small dishes intended for individual use. Each group is unique, though for different reasons. And you can see, even just a cursory glance, these are two very different types of vessels. Even a non-archaeologist like myself can figure that out. As Andrea argues, the first two groups have no known template that craftsmen would have drawn upon. In other words, they are new both in form and production materials. So we have a set of vessels that have no earlier template, and thus must have served a new function. Here we see a good example of where the material remains can only take us so far. Now we need the text. As many scholars have noted, the most likely function revolves around religious rituals associated with heightened emphasis on emerging norms of purity. Some traces of this can be seen in the material, in the literary record. Perhaps most famously, John 2, one of the New Testament Gospels, recounts the story of Jesus turning water into wine at a wedding at Cana. An incidental aspect of this story is the vessels used to perform the miracle. And here you have the top text on your handout. Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons, right? This corresponds with the large size of these vessels here. The passage, however, does not elaborate on what these purification rituals would have been. The earliest rabbinic document, the 3rd century Mishnah that I've alluded to before, provides some potential insights. A passage associates stone vessels with purification rituals. In this case, hand washing. And here I'm reading from the second passage. To render the hands clean, a quarter log of water do they pour for hands, for one, also for 2. With all sorts of utensils do they pour water for hands, even with utensils made of dung, utensils made of stone, utensils made of unbaked clay. I'm not so sure that we would be so excited about using a utensil made out of dung, but there is evidence that this was used mostly to patch things up. Elsewhere, the Mishnah records a legendary tale about children who would use stone vessels to collect water that would be mixed with the purifying ashes of the red heifer. Presumably, the stone vessels would have been utilized to add an extra layer of purification and protection from potential sources of contagion. The latter two types of vessels are not new in form at all. Rather, as Andrea has demonstrated, they reflect stone versions of service and display vessels made of finely glazed pottery or silver that Jews had long employed. Here, the picture on the left is what we have. In other words, Jews were trading in their fancy Phoenician and Italian imports, like we see on the right, a picture of some imports from Gamla. They were trading in their fancy Phoenician and Italian imports for plain local stone vessels. On the one hand, Jews with stone replicas of fancy imported tableware were asserting their Jewish identity by employing the most avant-garde forms in the prevailing Jewish production materials. At the same time, by deliberately choosing stone vessels, they were likewise participating in the practice of incorporating non-priestly purity practices into their daily lives. By the end of the 1st century CE, the stone vessels begin to disappear from the archaeological record. There's a certain irony here. The stone vessels attest to the practice of ritual purity outside of the temple. That is a robust culture of Jews who can live the life of priests, who can live that life of connection to their deity without the intermediating elements of building and religious practitioners. Yet when the temple is actually destroyed, Jews seem to have ceased engaging in this particular element of non-priestly purity regulation. This suggests that notwithstanding the rabbinic document's heavy emphasis on non-priestly purity, the common Jew, at least from the 1st century onward, seems to be less interested in continuing these norms of practice. At least for this particular aspect, we could discuss this in other contexts in a different discussion. If we situate these observations within the broader intellectual inquiry that I have outlined here, we can draw some definitive conclusions. A distinct set of practices emerges in the 1st century BCE among Jews of all types, poor, wealthy, urban, rural, that seek to live a life of purity in an imitation of the priests in the temple. This allows us to so-called trust the evidence provided by the later rabbinic and New Testament evidence, right? That long history of Jewish law and practice. When these two corpora speak of the Pharisees eating in a state of ritual purity, the presence of the stone vessels in the Second Temple period makes such an assertion highly likely. But the emphasis on the Pharisees in these texts underscores one of the major challenges with writing history from texts. Rabbinic literature in the New Testament have a unique interest in the Pharisees for different reasons, and as such, the overemphasis on the purity practices of the Pharisees obscures what the material culture indicates was far more widespread. The Pharisees were certainly the elite, but here we have the physical remains of the non-elite, presumably. If we go back to the earlier Second Temple period texts that indicate purity regulations for life outside the temple, we can be confident that these texts are not all literary in nature. To be sure, there are some texts, such as the Temple Scroll from among the Dead Sea Scrolls, that was the image you saw on the first slide, that outline an idealistic vision of Jewish society and religious practices. But other texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls present a far more quotidian vision of purity regulation, such as ritual bathing before meals. And of course, we have lots of ritual baths at the site of Qumran, where these people presumably lived. Reading these texts alongside the material culture remains, such as the stone vessels, indicate these passages from these various documents throughout the Second Temple period were not simply academic discussions. Rather, to return to my earlier analogy, we get a glimpse behind the curtain to see the lived Jewish experience and witness a sliver, still just a sliver, of its origins and historical development. Thank you. Sure.
The floor is now open for questions.
In the mapping of the stone vessels, you've emphasized their relative absence or complete absence from Samaria.
Yes.
Geologically,
Yes.
are there materials available to be made locally in that particular area?
That's a great question, which I do not know the answer to, whether they would be local, but even if there were not local wares available, they certainly could be imported. Right? I would guess there's a lot of stone available throughout the land of Israel, and I'm sure they would find a place for the quarry. In fact, when you look at the workshops, they're all over the place. So my guess is if Jews or others in this area of Samaria wanted to get stone vessels, they would have been accessible. Yeah. So the absence of them, right, just as we constantly emphasize when things begin to emerge in the material record, we also have to think about when the absence of that same material evidence, when it's either popping up elsewhere or when it's disappearing from the record as it is at the tail end of the 1st century CE. Yes?
Could you please put back this Josephus text?
Sure.
I noticed something interesting.
Sure.
You see, it says that that the Jews have been found grateful to the Roman people, not only at this time but at the time past.
Yes.
That's why we found, what does it say, that the Jews should have liberty to do all their things. Did you notice this?
Yes.
The reasons for Augustus, because during his father and his reign, they kind of granted Jews liberty because they found they were thankful.
Yes, this is interesting because when we think about the story of the Romans and the Jews, we tend to think about 66 to 70 CE, and where there's this horrible clash of armies, right? And some people have expanded that story to think of it as a clash of civilizations, right? The Romans and the Jews, the kind of Romans as the continuity of Hellenistic culture could not get along with the Jews hated the Romans. And yes, this is true, right? Like any imperial force and the colonized people, they didn't always get along, right? But what we are seeing here are, again, like I said, glimpses behind the curtain to see that in spite of the clashes and in spite of the horrible way that the story ends, this is not the entire story, right? There's a lot of confluence of cultures. There's a lot of creativity that's happening here. A lot of what we heard about last night was from an earlier time period. But in many ways, that idea of being of one world continues to exist even within the Roman imperial setting of 1st century BC and CE Judea.
Don't you think that this concept might help in our present time? for better relationships?
Yes, of course. I mean, I think that's an understatement. That there are, again, if we tend to write history of big empires fighting, and this tends to be the story of one empire destroying another. In fact, this is also oftentimes the narrative of Jewish history. Right? I spoke about kind of a scale of the history of Jewish law. But in many ways, if you look at an entire kind of body of histories of Judaism from antiquity to the modern period, they were oftentimes characterized by the same way of one destruction layer after another, right? But these aspects of confluence between cultures could be a very meaningful model for confluence today. And again, today we tend to emphasize the clash, but there's a lot of wonderful confluence that happens across cultures alongside that. Yes?
I'm not sure why you said that you did find the material vessels so much in Samaria. Why was
So
that?
Samaria was home to a group of people that worshiped the same God as, we would say, the Jews of Jerusalem. So they worshiped the God Yahweh, who's the God of the ancient Israelites. But by this time period, Jews located in Judea and also in Galilee kind of had a distinct vision of how their Judaism should be practiced and how their God should be worshipped. That is, the God of the Hebrew Bible that becomes their God. Whereas those people in Samaria, who are either identified as Samaritans or Samaritans, historians debate when to kind of change the language here, were kind of cousins of sorts in religious practice because they followed many of the much of the world of the Hebrew Bible and the God of the Hebrew Bible. But in actual practice, they were distinct from Jews in other areas. Though, if you should note, I'll bring back the other slide here, in the 2nd century BCE, from the perspective of the Seleucid Empire, they're one and the same, right? So from an insider's perspective, Jews and Sumerians or Samaritans see themselves as distinct. This is actually part of a long-standing kind of culture of the Samaritans kind of on the margins of Judaism, right? This is the story of the famous Good Samaritan, right? The Good Samaritan helps the Jew in the ditch, whereas all the other real Jews walk by, right? The whole point of the story is that the Samaritan is not viewed as a real Jew from the perspective of all those Jews who just didn't help their neighbor, right? So the Samaritans or the Sumerians are related in some respects, but what we see here is they are not, from the inside, practicing the same form of Judaism that the Jews in, say, Jerusalem or the Galilee are practicing, right? Certainly by the 1st century BC and CE, when we start to see some of those material remains. It may be that if we go back to the 2nd century BCE, the lumping together of Sumerians and Jews may either be because, from the perspective of the Greeks, they're all the same, or it may very well be that they're closer than we think. Yes?
So I'm really just talking by the very little information that I know, okay?
Sure.
So take my comments with a grain of salt. First of all, there's an oral tradition in Judaism. And the oral tradition, I'm sure, at this time would have been much stronger at the time of the Second Temple in that area than it would have been all the way in the north in Samaria. I mean, the message would have gotten diluted. So that might be one reason why the practices might have been changed or diluted because they were further away, they didn't go to the temple, and they were wealthier. And I'm sure that's one of the problems that happened in Greece during the time of the Maccabees, that a lot of the wealthier Jews were more willing to accept a Greek notion than were the priests, the Maccabees.
Sure. There's actually a lot of interesting elements of the question because when you talk about an oral tradition, my sense is that you're talking about what the later rabbis imagine as an oral interpretation of how Jewish law and practice should be done. Mm-hmm. There's actually no evidence that such a tradition existed. Clearly, the elite, the scholars, the priests are discussing these things, and they're debating the particulars of Jewish law, and they're seen as ancient, right? We saw several references to the fact that these laws were ancestral, they're traditions of the fathers. Josephus tells us specifically that the Pharisees imagined their practices as based on the traditions of the fathers, that they're old, they're not new, right? Because the older something is, the more authentic it's deemed to be. But the notion that there is an official oral tradition that goes alongside the biblical text that explain what Jews should be doing is actually a relatively later development. It doesn't start to appear in the Jewish text until the rabbinic period from the 3rd century onward. And in fact, actually what's really happening, it's not just an issue of wealthy versus non-wealthy, right? It's really an issue of distinctive identities about Judaism. The Maccabees, on the one hand, are elite, but in the early stages of the 2nd century BCE, they seem to be great champions of Jewish ritual and practice, right? How they see it, of course. We have other wealthy segments of ancient Judaism that are very adamant in support of a more strict adherence to Jewish ritual and practice. The priests, right, who are part of the elite. What's of interest to me here is when we move beyond those elite circles, the people whose words get put down in text, the academic discussions that become the literary record, what's everybody else doing? Okay? And it's not necessarily about engaging with Greek culture or not Greek culture, because in many ways, many aspects of ritual practice do become enriched by the incorporation of Greek culture. The temple is a great example of this. The temple in the 1st century BCE that's massively renovated by Herod and becomes this kind of premier institution for the lived Jewish experience, is in many respects a Hellenistic temple, right? Worshiping the God of Israel. The architecture, many aspects of its experience are completely in line in incorporating much of what is going on in the broader world of Greek and Roman culture. And it's the same way when you walk into a synagogue or a church, they reflect the kind of material culture of the society that is around and dominant when these are built. Yes?
That was a question I was going to ask about that the Western Wall is
Sure.
like the holiest spot in Jerusalem,
Sure.
but it was built by Herod, one of the most corrupt
Yes.
people
Take what you
in
can
Jewish
get.
history. And
The-
it's just
I'll go you one step further. The Western Wall is not even part of the temple.
It's
Herod had to expand the temple precincts. In order to do so, he had to level the ground. So he had to build these great retaining walls to hold the dirt. The Western Wall, if I had the picture readily available, I'd throw it up, where you see the entire Temple Mount precinct, and I have the Western Wall kind of highlighted here. You see it's like this tiny little flip in the bottom corner of a retaining wall, right? So you're right? And Herod is again one of these complicated figures. Like he's remembered by our literary records as a tyrant, right? A much later author talks about how it would be better to be a pig in Herod's household than to be a relative, because he adhered to some aspects of Jewish ritual practice, but of course he had no problem killing his family members. But the Herod of the archaeological record is very different. This is a massive builder, right, who not just builds edifices in honor of his patrons in Rome and their deeds, but also to the God of Israel. Right? So we only had the temple in Jerusalem. Let's take this example. Let's take this as a thought experiment. Let's say we had no Josephus. We knew nothing about Herod. He didn't show up in the New Testament as this kind of, also this confusion about who the Herod is, but the name Herod never showed up in the New Testament as the bad guy. He never showed up in Josephus, and all we had was a little cornerstone that came from the Jerusalem temple. And it said, built by Herod the Great, in whatever year you want to put it at. We would love Herod. Right? So much of our image of, I'm not the Herod apologist by any means, right? He was a bad guy, right? But I mean to say so much of it is colored by the way he's remembered by history. Right? Yeah.
Do we know if the Jews in Rome participated in the Roman army? And did that create a conflict?
We presumably, Jews in different parts of the Roman diaspora would have been involved to some degree. I'm not sure what the exact data numbers, but I think that a Jew in a particular region, if they would be part of the local army or be part of any of the local infrastructure, they would do that willingly and a participant in that local culture. Again, a Jew in Rome is not in a constant sort of conflict with the Roman world around them, right? So there are opportunities for conflict. Maybe the army would be a little more challenging because some of those troops are being sent to Jerusalem in the first century. But I think we need to de-emphasize some of the narrative of a constant clash of civilization, which is a lot of what we heard about last night.
I think we have time for one more question.
Who wants to go back? Go ahead.
You focused on vessels, but there must be other items that could be focused on to.
Sure. In fact, I'll show you one of the most important one of the other most important items, right? This is like an understatement. What you see here, and we saw a picture of one of these last night. This is a mikveh, a ritual bath, which we find in great abundance in this time period. Again, something that begins to pop up, so to speak, in the material remains, which demands explanation. Right? So that's another example. On the other hand, there are some things, some parts of my kind of broader story that I want to tell for which we have zero material remains. Right? The reference to this observance of the Sabbath, right? We have all these literary texts. Here's a good example of one that talk about what people do and don't do on the Sabbath. Right? So the particular example here, we're told that Jews don't go before judges on the Sabbath. They don't have court proceedings. That same regulation is found in later rabbinic texts. Right? We know about this in all kinds of literary texts. Right? Presumably this was one of the aspects of Jewish practice. Right? It's so peculiar that it doesn't seem to be just part of the imagination of the Sabbath. But how do you find that the material remains? Right? It's very hard to kind of track that. Right? So we have to kind of, on the one hand, work with the physical data that we have, and be conscious of the fact that it's a very incomplete data set. And the literary texts are also incomplete and complicated in other sorts of ways. That's why I think this kind of narrative text and material culture perhaps has that kind of ability to tell a larger story, and certainly not the complete story.
Was this different in Samaria? The
Yes,
ritual
sure.
bath?
Yes. You could also chart these differences in different places, in the kind of distinctly Jewish realms versus the non-Jewish realms. Absolutely.
And on that note,
There's more to come though next week.